Hi, this is Chiezan, the prior at SokukoJi Buddhist Monastery. If you value these talks and would like them to continue, please visit our donate page at www.sokukoji.org. Thank you.
This evening I asked Sokuzan to talk about a topic that I've been trying to look at myself, maybe not so much in a scholastic sense, but in a practical sense, in a practice sense. And it's a topic I've talked about a bit before, but it's been showing up a little bit differently, and that's the topic of bodhicitta. And I particularly want to talk about how, as practitioners, bodhicitta is not always accessible in the sense we read about it.
Recording in progress.
But in what sense is it accessible? So bodhicitta, just to give the background on that word, a lot of us are familiar with it. Bodhi is a Sanskrit word meaning awake or awakened, and chitta is often translated as mind. But what that term often points to is the mind inspired to awaken others. So it's very much a core aspect of the bodhisattva path. And it's everywhere. You can read about it from Shantideva in the Bodhicharyavatara, or you can read about it in Atisha's 7 Points of Mind Training and 59 Slogans. And it's most commonly broken down into ultimate and relative bodhicitta. Ultimate bodhicitta is the direct recognition of emptiness, seeing the world as an illusion. Whereas relative bodhicitta is kind of like being a doctor for the world, that you function to alleviate the suffering of others, oftentimes in a relative sense. The most traditional practice around this is called Tonglen, which is the sending and receiving while riding the breath. And it is simply the idea that with the inhale, you receive the suffering of the world or an individual or a situation. And with the exhale, you offer all well-being, all goodness, all merit in the form of light to those that are suffering. And we really need teachings like this because they provide us a little bit of energy. They can be inspiring. They motivate us to want to serve the world. But when we wake up and step outside of our houses, the actuality of trying to implement that can be very artificial. And so we find ourselves going to war with ourselves, trying to be more compassionate and more soft and being this grand savior of the world. And to me, what we fail to recognize is the richness of our suffering as the access or the entryway to bodhicitta. And so Trungpa Rinpoche talked about bodhicitta as being a wound. And so I want to talk a little bit about this wound or this tenderness. And that tenderness is very raw. It's very intimate. And because of that, we spend our lives protecting. We spend our lives trying to cover up that open wound that causes us to feel so deeply. And the three poisons are the main defenses we have from preventing that wound from being exposed, that tenderness from being triggered. And so if we look at the poison, the klesha of anger or aggression, the way that shows up, to think of it as an image. If you think of an actual literal wound on your body and something were to touch that, it's electric. If it's a nerve that's being touched, it is immediate and overwhelming. And the passion or the poison of aggression is to stop it through force, through destruction, through hatred, shutting down. And so oftentimes we have interactions with the world that touch that sensitive part of us, that wound, that vulnerability that we are not invincible, we are not as solid as we believe we are. And so we respond out of aggression where we actually immediately reject the very thing that's coming towards us because it's too much, it's too sensitive, it's too overwhelming. And I also would like to utilize the example of the teacher as embodying or manifesting as these three poisons to point us to that rawness. So the nature of the student-teacher relationship, again, if we read about it, can be romanticized in such wonderful ways. And we think about these great characters throughout the history of our lineages who were able to endure so much. And the way we think about it in our mind, or many of us perhaps, is that Milarepa just had this profound resolve, and he was able to just withstand Marpa's treatment of him. And then we feel humiliated or ashamed because we react and we fight and we justify and we defend. And so the teacher may come in and very sharply push his fingers into the wound. And then we have a chance to see how I don't want that too much. Passion functions similarly. It's like we have this wound and we want to dress it. We want to put something over it. We want to put a salve over it. We want to put a bandage over it. We want to protect that wound. So we start to grasp at aspects of our life that give us a buffer, give us a barrier from the world. And I would say for a lot of us, this might be very indicative of an early part of our relationship with Sokuzan or a teacher. We come to the teacher every time I'm suffering, every time something went wrong. As I've said before, for the first years of being here, I would say I had Dokusan every single day, or almost every single day. If Sokuzan was in here, I won't say bugging him, but anyone else that would have probably been bugging him. And it's because I'm starting to practice, and this sensitivity, this rawness, this wound, this tenderness is not so easily ignored anymore. So you go to an external source and some pacifying would occur, some support, some direction, but all done in such a way that can lead up to maybe that more direct jabbing or pointing at. And our ignorance is, to me, it's a little bit of passion and it's a little bit of aggression, but it's not so object specific. It's like anything else that we can give our attention to that would distract us from the rawness of our experience. And that rawness is not other than the first noble truth that we're reminded of on a daily basis of life is suffering. And so for me, in reflecting on bodhicitta, sometimes it's nice to idealize it and romanticize it and read about these wonderful slogans and these wonderful gestures and these great compassionate beings that live for the benefit of others. But when the rawness of my experience becomes too much, it's easy to think that there is no bodhicitta. Instead of looking at how the very expression is showing up, can't show up if it's not acknowledging that sensitivity to the world. But what happens is we take those three poisons when they get triggered and we use them to continue to solidify our identity. We continue to use those to protect ourselves from the directness of what is occurring. And so we use these forms, but we should always have some sense in the back of our mind that at some point the teachings as concepts are not enough. That when reference points really begin to slip away and we're left with the most raw quality of our experience, it probably won't be enough to say Marpa, Milarepa, Bodhidharma, Huinam, Bodhicitta, because it is so raw. So we have to come back to our intention. We come back to square one. We come back to dukkha. We come back to suffering. And we have to be very honest with ourselves and say, we were told this from day one. Life is suffering, and this is a path of looking at that suffering. So here we are having this wound poked at, or ignored, or not dressed, or not taken care of in a way we would prefer. And instead of seeing that as an opportunity to feel, receive the most raw and direct aspects of what is arising, We get caught up in the fighting, we get caught up in the grasping, we get caught up in the ignoring. So bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, the aspiration to serve others, while it can be written about beautifully, if you really consider what you are asking to do on the bodhisattva path, you are asking to suffer for the rest of your existence. Because as SokukoJi has said before, as long as one person is suffering, you can't be free of suffering. And I guess this is maybe a talk to myself more than anything right now. But it's just that reminder that when we start to have that rawness, that is our path. And it's not to say that we can't use some intelligence to navigate that, or maybe look at ways we might be able to work with it without overwhelming ourselves, but to not lose sight of the First Noble Truth and that vow to be with the First Noble Truth. Are there any questions this evening? Milka?
Milk bowing, that rawness or tenderness, is that always available?
I think so, but I also don't think it's limited to an experience. I think for me right now, it's very experiential. There's just a lot of sensitivity. There's a lot of reactivity. There's a lot of like those jolts to the nervous system. But I don't think that having access to that tenderness or rawness requires us to constantly be in a state of agitation. The agitation probably is indicative of some sort of defense trying to take hold still. For me, that's how it shows up.
Milk bowing, how does the defense show up?
The reactivity to the rawness, experiencing it with the addition of suffering or the addition of negativity or the addition of wanting to resolve it. So it still has some sort of directionality. It's still wanting direction. And if we look at, again, the three poisons, part of why they are so effective in maintaining territory is I think they do provide a type of release that when we talk about that word outflow, when we externalize through passion, aggression, and ignorance, we are off-gassing some of that negativity. We're like taking a little pressure off the pressure cooker. And we take it down just enough where we feel okay and we don't have to look at it anymore. And then the pressure builds and builds and builds and builds. And then we outflow just enough to take the pressure down again. And so it's that vicious cycle of passion, aggression, and ignorance. You know, the aggression, the outflowing, the passion of remorse, and then the ignorance of it going under the radar and building up again. Questions?
Sure, Brian. When you talk about the rawness or the suffering, for me, there's like a visceral component of something that I can go to and experience. But what?
Louder, please.
But what is that rawness or what is that suffering? It seems like I can describe it or I can name it or feel it, but I don't know what it is.
It feels like the suffering quality is using the three poisons to try to resolve something that doesn't need resolution. So it creates a type of friction or warfare. And so the energy itself, it may be very straightforward, but the reaction is to do something with it, which is fight, get rid of it through fighting, pacify it through passion, distract ourselves through ignorance. And so we take what really doesn't need modification and we change it, and we use that to reassure ourselves of our identity, of our locality.
Shokubang, that suffering, at least what I resonate with when you speak about it, it has like a locality, like I can go with it. But does that rawness, is that limited to a locality?
I can only speak to it in a path sense. And I think that, at least for right now, that's where I try to take my seat, is that I could speculate, or we could philosophize, or we could conceptualize something that can't be conceptualized. But for those of us on the path, we have to start where we are. And so if you're describing it as acknowledging there is a visceral reaction, that's where the attention goes. And if that visceral reaction takes on some sort of direction in the form of passion, aggression, and ignorance, that's where we go. We're not looking for it to stop any of that. So limited to a locality, not limited to a locality, it feels like it may pacify or satisfy us for a moment. But where I'm at right now is, how can I return directly to what is showing up? Because oftentimes the energy is about what comes next. How do I progress the path? How do I evolve or mature my path? And that's, I think, almost an exact question I asked in Dokusan today. And so just returning to, how is it showing up right now? And if it needs to go somewhere, if it needs to be with or without direction, with or without location, that's, in a sense, it's none of your business. Allow that to show up as it needs to. But our intention is look at it in the form it shows up for us. Munyo?
When you were describing the circle of the three poisons, something happens, we react to it aggressively, and then we may have remorse about it, and then we sink back into it. What is the antidote to that behavior, Bowen?
I feel that what we're returned to is the awareness of that behavior. And the way that the talk Sokuzan gave, see the impulse. I think there's something to that for me, that if I can be looking directly at the aggression as it arises, even if the outflow arises, and you're looking at that, you can begin to see the impulse to morph it into something else. And it is incredibly uncomfortable to not turn that into some sort of passion. So to stay with whatever degree of outflow we've had is, or can be, excruciating, because we are just humiliated. We don't have a chance to show that we actually knew better, and we're going to acknowledge to others we know better so that they know that we knew better. And now we can go back and everything's okay for now. And so it's just, I think humiliating is a word that would resonate for me. It's just embarrassing to have any one of those poisons be acknowledged and not immediately take the next lap around the track.
Is it possible to stop that going around the track one more time?
What's interesting is, anytime that comes up, is it possible? I think well, of course it's possible. I imagine there's all sorts of tricks, styles, techniques, but you can't restrain dependent origination. And those expressions of passion, aggression, and ignorance are not the result of one source. They're not just like this result of this little me that can then, cut all the causes and conditions. So there's a sort of disrespect we might have if we think that we have the on-off switch to passion, aggression, and ignorance. I think the directionality becomes much more ambiguous when it's not being funneled through an agenda. So it's the directionality of passion, aggression, and ignorance, and those three, and how they are used to solidify the identity, that we may have a chance to see more clearly, so we don't keep that cycle going, not of passion, aggression, and ignorance, but of collecting those and using those as reference points or touchstones for who we are. Hondo.
Divine, what is the role of that humiliation or failure?
Thank you. The role of the humiliation and failure isn't, I don't feel it's a role at all. That just as the passion, aggression, and ignorance arise out of dependent origination, the humiliation does as well. But that's another like can of gasoline, because it shows up, and because it's so distasteful, we think we need to resolve that. We think we need to not do it again, or create an identity where we don't have to be exposed. So just as anything else that arises, in as far as we're able to, it's about giving our attention to it. It's just difficult. I think that for some of us more so than others, but there are few things worse than feeling embarrassed. And again, some people are able to have more humor around it. That may not be everyone's difficulty. I know for me, it's very difficult not to maintain to the extent where it's very hard to, point that out.
Divine, are you saying that then that failure or humiliation are nothing different than suffering? Bowing?
The way I understand it is that just as any other aspect of phenomena would arise, they would just be give your awareness to it. I'm not saying that on the path we might not work with it in a different way to help us go deeper into what is arising. But if we can think of it in its most simple form, which I tend to be quite simple, I feel, is just as any other characteristic would arise. Just be tentative to see what direction you think it's pointing. And as the intensity of what is arising increases, the impulse to take a direction seems to increase as well. So it's much harder to hold our seat or just receive or just observe when the situation is that much more charged with emotion or preferences or opinions.
Mozuku bowing. The way you were describing, it sounded like you were saying, maybe my first question is, are you recommending, if we can, to have that rawness poked in whatever way, and then the aggression comes up and you might have to watch yourself outflow, and then you stay with the humiliation of that and not try to, is that part of what you're recommending?
If I could put an image to it, think about trains on a car, or on a cars on a train. Have to be a big car to have a train on it. A car is on a train. It's and every car is at the next elaboration. I don't think our goal is to just have the engine or to have an empty track. So to whatever extent we have elaborated, 2 cars, 5 cars, 10 cars, 100 cars, that's where we see it. We don't need to say, I'm at 100 cars and man, I wish I was back at 10 cars. I'm going to try to get back. I'm going to try to cut 90 of these cars off. I'm going to try to cut off 90% of my elaboration and get back to some artificial first experience of it. And so when I'm talking about that cycle of passion, aggression, and ignorance, I'm not saying that here's the point where you should try to cut it off, but to whatever extent you spontaneously elaborate, to whatever extent you spontaneously go around that track, that's where we see it. And this is another question I've asked Sokuzan. It's if you elaborate, should you try to go back to the first situation? And I believe his response is you can't. The image I think of is okay, you have the first situation, then you have your elaboration, and what it looks like to go back to the first situation is a third layer. It's you actually add one more layer of the projection of the first situation, so it becomes more and more convoluted. And so it's disappointing because we may have to see our minds take something to the 10th degree. But once it's there, once it's elaborated, once it's evolved to that, that's where we look at it.
Thank you. That was helpful. Mozuku bowing, is there room in the practice at whatever point we see that? I don't know what phrase to use because my question is how would that show up? But to maybe acknowledge how our outflows impact other practitioners and the people around us.
You might, and I don't think a standard could be set up in that regard, and that shouldn't surprise you at all. That the tendency is to express remorse with the hope of eliciting acknowledgement or forgiveness. It is rarely a simple gesture to just acknowledge. I apologize that I did that. I realized that wasn't helpful. It's more of can't you see? Can't you recognize you were at fault a little bit too? So I would just be very tentative anytime that shows up as an impulse to explain or justify or apologize. And again, I'm not saying not to apologize. I know for me, sometimes it helps to have a little bit of a pause or a break, so it's not a reactionary situation. That's actually more intentional than reactional.
Mozuku bowing, some of my experience has been, I mean, we're practicing, it's an intimate situation, people are suffering, outflows happen, but that it can sometimes look like an environment where we're implicitly justifying dumping our negativity on Sangha by, well, that's the practice. So
I would, if anyone were to say that to me, I would probably keep my mouth shut and say, you should say that to Sokuzan. I've never, ever heard anyone say, just let it rip, just, dump on people. There is the acknowledgement that despite best intentions, that happens. I think that's the softness that's trying to be acknowledged is as human beings, you are going to outflow. But if you can do your best to hold your seat, if you can do your best to do less, endeavor to do that. But the acknowledgement is we're not trying to maintain some sort of artificiality either. So if anyone was trying to justify being belligerent, just being hurtful, would trust Sokuzan to relate to them as a student. But I would be very skeptical of that kind of, it just doesn't smell good.
Mozuku bowing, as a Sangha, how can we create an environment that, or maybe we don't even want to, so I guess I don't know that, but where there is enough softness and acknowledgement of how we're affecting each other, that we're not just ignoring each other and creating that kind of hardness.
I will just say this, and I'd be happy to respond. I would say we're really concerned about the outflowing and the abrasion and the clashing, but how much energy, we want to exert all this energy into that situation. How much attention are we paying to basic kindness? I'm not talking about something terribly elaborate, but I feel like that would be a starting point, because if you have a basis of respect and kindness, it makes it a lot easier to communicate around the difficulty. If you have no relationship and if you remain isolated, it may be workable for you, but it doesn't provide a lot to return to when the conflict arises. So I think that the little conversations we have in the kitchen around coffee, or in the front garden on Sunday morning, or in the white Tara room or after forms, those little interactions are fairly benign seeming, but they help provide some sort of fabric of the Sangha. So that's something I feel strongly about, and I think that's something we're endeavoring to look at with the community too, is how can we be friends and neighbors so that we're not waiting for some event to happen where we need to come together, but we have no relationship.
Was it bowing? Another aspect of an aspect of the environment that can, I think, be jarring for somebody who maybe new or not have any relationships in the community or have that kind of basis, can just even be the way we move around such a small space that can show up as somebody new might just want to like get out of the way and scurry away and get out of the corner. So is there a way that we can work with that and acknowledge that that might be hard to adjust to?
I think I already see a number of people that make it a point to interact with new people and to orient them to the space and invite them to participate to the extent they feel comfortable. And so again, it doesn't have to be a script. Here's the script for when a new person comes. I think just that basics, just kindness that's expressed, goes a lot more, it goes a lot longer, a lot further than making sure we protect them from every abrasive quality. We don't want to do too much of that. So I would just say, again, as we have people show up, engage with them and show them around and get to know them, ask them if they have questions, just have a conversation. Other questions, Shoka?
SokukoJi, you mentioned that bodhicitta is a topic that you return to often in your practice. And I'm wondering if you can say what it is that inspires you to look at that as a teaching, and then how that's changed or deepened over the years.
For me, I think anything that reminds me of the vow, which I think bodhicitta is, in an ultimate sense, to see the lack of self in other, and in a relative sense, to just try to not make more difficulty in the world, and if we can, try to ease things, make it a little more workable for people to live their lives. So in that sense, it is applicable. For me, it feels so pragmatic. It's not as, it can be very abstract. If you read like the Bodhisattva Bhumi Sutra, I don't resonate with that. That's harder for me to understand. It gets very, the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva. So in that sense, it can be very inspiring. And I think the way it has been changing over the years is that initially it worked as inspiration to give me energy. And now it is beginning to see the pragmatism and the actuality of what we have taken vows to do. And so when it becomes that difficult to face this vow of the suffering of the world, to know that that is the very path I asked Sokuzan to teach me. So it's evolved in that way, is that it's not just thoughts, and it's much more painful as it begins to show up. And I'm not talking about a fruitional quality. I'm just talking about there's so much less romanticism about suffering and being with all beings than there was when I first started practicing.
SokukoJi, how do you relate to the idealism around not making life difficult for other people, and what that actually is as a
We just return to the idea of a simple intention as opposed to an accomplishment. I don't think it's an idealistic situation to intend to be kind. I think it becomes idealistic when it starts to put up boundaries that accepts and rejects and functions out of force. And I find that it's helpful. It's helpful to just interact with people. Just interacting is a kindness. It's not like I have something to offer you. It's not an action of like buying your groceries or washing your car for you. It's just interacting itself, acknowledging just the basic dignity, the basic intelligence of somebody is a kindness. And I don't think that that necessarily is idealistic. It just comes back to very functional feet on the ground. Jishin?
Jishin bowing. Can you hear me? I am in different setting, and can you hear me?
Yes.
This is a very touching topic to me, and very difficult. I really don't know even how to talk about this. At the same time, I feel I have a desire to talk. So my question is when the combination of feelings of that rawness and tenderness, pain and sweetness comes, and it's extremely powerful, which happened to me after the monk's talks on Saturday, and I was wondering what actually caused that sudden that reaction in me. Is there any value in exploring and even asking questions about the nature of something of this kind of experience, or is it just an elaboration, adding to something which just should be felt? Bound.
I think in the context of the path, it might be helpful. You're a student of Sokuzan's, so that would be a good direction to ask questions about it. And I don't know why, but this showed up right away, is that, so you listen to the monk talks, you have this strong response, reaction, whatever it was arising, is that may be a time to go directly to the cushion and not do anything with it. You actually can feel what that is in the body, and it won't last. So you're sitting, you will actually, if you sit there long enough, you will watch it start to fade, and you'll start to miss it. And like, oh, I wish I could, if it was a pleasant experience, you wish I could get that back. So that might be another way to work with it, is that if you are in a position to do so, head immediately to your cushion or your chair or wherever you're able to practice, and sit there and watch as that thing that seems so powerful vanishes. We have to sit there for a while, maybe not so long at all, I don't know.
Thank you, Jishin bowing. Is it always an expression of bodhicitta when this kind of experience is appearing in that form of rawness and rawness and tenderness at the same time? Bowing.
I think the bodhicitta is always there, but what you're describing sounds a little bit like a very soft type of passion. There's some sort of positivity, or there's something that feels progressive about it, perhaps. And I could be wrong. Maybe that was exactly what showed up for you, but bodhicitta in its ultimate sense, and if we ultimate and relative, doesn't have an experience to it. It's not identified by showing up or having particular feelings or characteristics. Those are just feelings, they're just characteristics, and they don't really require any further elaboration on them. So I just come back to trying to be as simple as possible with it, and you may explore that with Sokuzan. But for me, my inspiration right now is very much in the midst of whatever intensity, positive or negative, to see if I can get right to the cushion and just watch what that is, because it's very seductive to turn it into something which validates us or validates our thoughts.
Thank you.
Milka.
Milka bowing, a question on YouTube from Spoolstring in the UK. Generally, people seem to prefer to be happy. What is the aversion to negativity, or what about narrative bad feelings? Is this the horrible thing exactly?
I might have to come back to some of that question, but I think the aversion to negativity is just very straightforward. It's just unpleasant. I don't know that it has to be more complicated than that, that when something is pleasant, it feels good. Something's unpleasant, it doesn't feel so good. So we try to manipulate our lives because we think that if we just get the code right, we can maintain the pleasantness, or just majority of the time pleasantness. And I think that this is where that aspect comes in that we call the spiritual path, is what is it that goes beyond pain and pleasure? Again, I don't think I followed the entire question there.
After the or, Milka bowing, after the or, he says, what about narrative bad feelings? Is this the horrible thing exactly?
I'd have to have that rephrased. I'm not quite following. Any other questions this evening? Did you?
True bowing. If that wound is being rotted and we have an impulse to do something to soften it, can we still bring or have an intention to have awareness while we cover it up?
I think so. Yes, I think very much so. I mean, if you're describing the situation, there's some awareness that this is getting to be a bit much, and you could say for the longevity of my practice, I'm going to need to turn down the heat a little bit so I can keep going. Because I've talked about you get that martyr mentality, and you just burn yourself out because you just think that there's something to just forcing yourself to feel the most excruciating pain at its highest level at all times, and we call that spiritual practice. I don't think that's the case.
Future value. How do we know when it's appropriate to soften it?
This is pretty unsatisfying, but I feel like you'll know it's appropriate when you do soften it. And there's no way to tell. We always go like 10 points further than we think we can go, and then we get mad. We kind of declare that we're going to soften this because this has gotten to be too much. And that's probably exactly where we needed to soften it at. Got a chance to see a little bit of that righteousness. My experience, not anyone else's, my experience.
Bowing, just a quick question. Can you say again what is the ultimate bodhicitta? Bowing.
One of the ways of saying it is seeing the world as an illusion, direct perception of emptiness. Rumi and I have started trying to learn German. Oh, danke. Stand and dedicate the mirror. I don't have that in German yet.
If you value these talks and would like them to continue, please visit our donate page at www.sokukoji.org. Thank you.